Hello and welcome to the Zero to Traction podcast, a podcast about how first-time founders create startups that scale. I'm one of your co-hosts, JDM, aka Josh David Miller, and I'm here with one of my other regular co-hosts, my friend on this side over here, Cameron Law. Cameron, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's good to be back in the studio and excited to be here and bring the Zero to Traction podcast back to life. So excited to
That
be here.
that's yeah, that's right. Super happy to be back in the studio for what we are calling the rumors of our death or greatly exaggerated edition of the Zero to Traction podcast because it has been a while since we recorded. I think our last episode dropped a year ago, something like that, and that was for a large number of reasons. I had a baby, and that just messes with your entire life, and that was heading us into the busy season for entrepreneurship, which, if you guys know, is November. The October and November are just crazy busy. We have Global Entrepreneurship Week and a number of other events, and so we decided what better way to enter that season this year than to start the podcast again and to see if we can keep up with it through our busy time. So I'm really happy to be back. Hope you're happy to be back too.
I'm
uh,
excited.
yeah, this is great. So today we want to talk about a topic that is not part of the typical language, I think, of the startup, which is this concept of cycles and the philosophy of cycles. The build, measure, learn, loop. All of that should be very familiar to you if you've read any of the startup literature or spent any time in that space. But we like to use the term cycles. We've been using that more and more in the events that we run. And so we want to take some time to actually talk about what we mean by cycles. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. We'll get started. So Cameron, you and I sort of birthed this cycles concept in its detailed form, at least, at an event that we created a few years ago that we run a couple times a year called the Startup Challenge. Why don't we start just by tell us about the Startup Challenge?
Well, awesome. Well, I think for some additional context around this idea of cycles was it really birthed out of this kind of the build, measure, learn loop, and where we thought it maybe wasn't fully resonating with founders. And not that the build, measure, learn cycle isn't right. It was more so of this nature of that you need to do this in a continuous way. And we often talk a lot about it's about building those behaviors, not just doing the checkbox item of I built something, I measured and I learned, and therefore I'm done with that. And so when we looked at this program called the Startup Weekend, which we ran one right before the pandemic back in 2020, I think it was a March timeframe. And but when we revisited bringing that program back, we really looked at the essence of what were we trying to create in that program, and we really wanted to instill this behavioral mindset shift within kind of the entrepreneurial community in our region. And so how do we then take this element of, yes, we want to help them go and do customer discovery and all of those process, but it's about kind of being very intentional in the way that they're going through that process. And so what we really started to reward was less of this performative aspect of, did I go get some survey data and I got I got some high level validation, and now I'm going to ultimately, do this charismatic pitch to hopefully win the competition. But it was really about this idea of gaining evidence, and through evidence that we're ultimately able to demonstrate the validation of our idea, our business model, and going forward. And so the way we've structured the program is that the more cycles and the more learning done in that weekend ultimately wins. And so it's about the progress you made, but telling us how the test that you ultimately did in the marketplace helped you learn something about your business or your idea, and how are you then able to make a decision, a pivot point, whatever that might be. And I know we'll dive down that going forward, but high energy event, and one that we really are focused on that behavioral aspect of getting in these cycles and building that process as you go forward. And I think, one of the things that I want to turn it over to you on is really this concept of like proportioning your effort to the evidence that you have and how that ties to cycles. I've always loved the way that you articulate and speak to that and support founders.
Yeah, and we'll put a link in the show notes if you're in the Sacramento area in September and you want to come learn by doing by actually seeing what it's like to create a company from nothing more than an idea while also doing the real work and not the performative work. You can come join the Startup Challenge. We'll put that. We got awesome prizes and it's a great program. So we'll put some links in the show notes for that. But yeah, this idea of proportioning your effort to the evidence. So there is this, I like the term that you use, and I think we use it a lot about like there's the performative aspects of entrepreneurship generally, but also any of these similar events to the Startup Challenge, right? Like the Startup Weekend and so forth, where it's about this pitch, it's the demo day. And it's all about like this big performance that you put on, and that even translates to like the little work where the stuff that you build becomes performative too. Like, oh, I was able to hack this thing together in a weekend. I was like, well, okay, great, I guess. Like that, what does that get you in terms of actually getting a business launched, or getting getting customers that are actually interested in something? And even when you think about like, okay, we got some developers together and we hacked together this proof of concept thing in a weekend. That's a lot of effort. I mean, it's a weekend, and so that's great. I mean, kudos for keeping it to a weekend. But at the end of the day, like, how did you know that that was the right thing to spend those 2 days building? And without a lot of data to do that, there's I think there's a lot better ways to spend that time. And this is where the idea of like proportioning your effort to the evidence comes in. If you have, it's like if you're gambling or playing cards, and
We're not recommending to go gambling.
yeah, disclaimer, don't sue us.
Yeah.
um we don't make us put the phone number for the gambling hotlines up on screen or in the show notes. But if let's say playing a friendly game of poker with your colleagues or buddies at the end of the day, and let's say you're playing hold'em and you're in an early position, you've seen your two cards, you've seen no bets from anyone else, all you have are the cards you've got in the hole here, and that's it. That's all the information that you have. Are you going to go all in? I mean, absent special circumstances, no, you're not going to do that, because that bet is not proportional to the evidence that you have. And you're not even going to make necessarily a large bet, again, on average. You're going to do some bet maybe to test, right? To signal, or to test. But if you're in a later position, you get more data. You've seen the bets that the other players have made. Some haven't bet, some have checked. Some folded, some maybe did a nice big bet. Now you have data that you can use to make a smarter bet. Then the flop comes, you see additional cards. Now you have even more data. Then you have more round of betting, and even more data on top of that. So you just have this continual data that you're getting in, and the bets that you're able to make can get bigger when you have more data that's leading to a signal that you're on the right track. And before you have those signals you're on the right track and that evidence, it doesn't make sense to do that. And the exact same thing applies to the startup world. You are making bets all the time. When you go to build something, when you go to hire something, when you go to raise money, all of that is a bet on a future. And if you don't have evidence to warrant the size of that bet, you're making too big of a bet. And so back to the example of like this performative aspect of creating a proof of concept, something in a weekend. If you don't have the evidence to warrant spending 2 full days just taking a shot in the dark, which if we're being honest, that's what you did, then it's time to figure out something different to do. And that's where this concept of cycles comes back into play. I have this concept that I use that I call time to customer. And the idea is it's a measurement. It's a measurement of the time it takes from when a cockamamie scheme enters your head for a business, for a feature, for anything, from the time it enters your head to the time you actually test it with real customers. Time to customer. And your goal should be to get that as short as possible. And a lot of founders, I think, start out by assuming that it's this long thing, that we're going to get this idea, we're going to build something that takes weeks or months, then we're going to put it in front of customers, we're going to learn, and we're going to refine. Months, right, to get to a time to customer. If we can narrow that down, like get that shorter, we are by definition making a smaller bet. And when you're in the later stages, if you're seed stage, Series A stage, a lot of your bets are going to take more time. They're going to take weeks, they're going to take months, some of them. But in the early stages, those bets, that time to customer is minutes or hours. That's it. So how do we get, Cameron, how do we get in those early stages, those cycles down to minutes or hours? Like if we're saying that's the wrong bet to go build something, what's the right bet to make?
Right. I mean, that's a great question. And I think a lot of it is to identify what is the riskiest thing for your business to be succeeding. Right. And so it's focusing on the things that matter at that time. And, we often fall into kind of the element of wanting to build things that, I would say are the technical work that feels good for us to go do, right? It's build the landing page, it's to ideate on the solution, because that drives that internal gratification for us in building those things forward. But our greatest risk, especially at those earliest stages, and or even if we, are even hitting scale and trying to bring in new product offerings into the market, is what I'm creating actually desirable by the marketplace, right? And so we need to be really intentional as we go and ultimately test those things in the market. And so, we often fall into what is that core hypothesis that you're testing? Is it the value that's going to be generated from it? Is it the way in which the product's actually going to be handled by our customer, or is it that we're even targeting the right person with the right problems, right? And so, at those earliest stages, it's just you can get in front of them in an early fashion through customer interviews and just conversational aspects of things going forward. But as you've built and established value and trust, that's where I think proportioning your effort to your bets is, if you already have established customers, the time to build that next set of testing is going to be much more intensive because you don't want to necessarily, hinder future engagements with them going forward. And so I think that that's a super crucial element as we're like tying these different concepts that I think, really through this podcast, one of our hope is for you as founders is that, you often get piecemeal of these tools. And so it's how can they ultimately be intertwined to help you in that process. And so this build, measure, learn is not just, a one thing that you do on a regular basis, but maybe that you have multiple tests going on, or that you're ultimately identifying what is it that you need to be building. And that build doesn't have to be the solution itself, right? It could be the interview idea that you're going to go forward with, and what is that hypothesis that you ultimately want to validate or invalidate. And I think a lot of times when we talk about like being comfortable with failure in this process, is that the invalidation of your hypotheses is a great learning. Right now, you actually have an ability to make a decision. Do I continue to persevere and go down that pathway and find more data that maybe does validate it down the line, or is this a pivot point that I need to go do something different, target a different audience? Maybe they have a different set of problems than we originally thought, or is this something where the evidence is saying maybe we shouldn't push forward with this idea, and that's okay. Now, if you've saved time, money, and energy, and now you can focus on the next idea or entrepreneurial opportunity that you see.
So I think this is probably a good opportunity to take kind of everything that we've just been talking about here and bubble it up into like, what do we mean by cycle? I think it's kind of implied that it's going out to the marketplace and talking to customers and getting data and coming back. But like when we say a cycle, what do we actually mean? And it is the build, measure, learn process. But as you said up top, Cameron, like the idea of build, measure, learn is like it doesn't really resonate, I think, is how you put it. And that's because build sounds like, well, we're going to go create some software or something like that, and eventually, sure, yes, and building features and testing and doing all that stuff, and then measure, learn, but like it doesn't seem to land, particularly in the early stages. But what we're really talking about is the build part is how do we ask a question of the marketplace, right? And it's the how part of that. And sometimes the how is an interview, sometimes it's building a feature, sometimes it's a landing page test, sometimes it's an ad, but there's something that we have to put together and then execute on in order to measure something. And that's the question that we're asking the marketplace. Will people, can people, that kind of thing. And then when the learn part of that is by we get that data back and we have to analyze it, figure out what does this mean, and then from that synthesize it into what we already know, and then begin again and say, like, what's the next thing we need to learn? How are we going to learn it? Let's go ask it. Let's measure some data. Okay, we got some data back. Analyze, synthesize, rinse, and repeat. And so I think if we just break each of those down, and let's start with the idea of an experiment, because I think that even though it's like the second step in the process, is like, how do we go about testing this? If we just start there, I think it'll start to clarify things. So we have this idea of that we use at the startup challenge that we call a test card or an experiment card. The particular formulation that we use comes from David Bland's, our friend David Bland's book, Testing Business Ideas, part of the Strategizer series. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to that. It's a great book. Also, lots of different ways that you can test things in there, both validation and discovery tests. So definitely check that out if you haven't read that book. But it's a few different stages for that. So it's, we believe that, right? So this is our hypothesis. And then in order to test that, we will. So this is what we're going to do in order to find out if we're right. And measure. So we have to measure something. Otherwise, we're just making things up and going with our gut. And then we are right if, right? So that measurement has to be something. So we believe that. To test that, we will. We and measure, and we are right if. Right? So that's the basic structure of the card. And so maybe we can just kind of break each of those down super quick and just go through that. So I'll take the first one, and then you can take the second one. So the 30,000 foot view, when we say we believe that, we're talking about an hypothesis. And so an hypothesis is something that's specific, it's discrete, it's falsifiable. So specific means that you have all of the pieces covered: the who, what, when, where, all of that, and how, right? Those basic questions are all answered. It's not, I believe that customers like this. That's not an hypothesis. You can start there, but then you have to get to, I believe this particular person is going to, then what does like this mean? Does that mean that they're going to opt in? Does that mean they're going to fill out their email address? Does that mean that they're going to buy? Like, what does it mean to like this more than, that? It could be customer interviews as well, and that you're looking for particular responses, emotional responses. All that's fine, but what does it mean to like this? Okay, so I believe the customers like this, so it has to be really, really specific into, this is what I mean by that. Discrete means that it has to test one thing. If you trying to test 5 or 6 things, you're just getting noise, and you're not going to find the signal for the noise. You're going to find fake signals, and it's going to lead you astray. So you're just testing one thing. So that's specific and discrete. And the last one is falsifiable. And Cameron, you already mentioned this, but this is the idea that you have to be able to be proven wrong. It has to be shown unambiguously to be true or false, and that's an hypothesis. So you start out with that. We believe that this thing that is specific and discrete and falsifiable, and then we go in to test that. We will. So walk us through what it means to run a test.
Yeah, and ultimately, it starts with the hypothesis, right? So if you're testing for, something as, am I targeting the right person? It's much harder to go build something where you don't know, you're not going to go build a landing page and not know who you're targeting, right? And so a lot of the tests you want to gear towards, are they geared towards a desirability, meaning do people care about it? Or are they viability tests around, can I actually, build the revenue or the cost elements related to it? And then lastly is that feasibility. So can I actually, maybe that's related to the technology. Can you actually build the thing that matters? And so as we look at building these tests, we want to ultimately, this is where I think it's key to proportion that effort to the evidence that you ultimately have at this point, right? And so as you're getting started, you don't want to go necessarily build this huge test that's going to take a bunch of time and energy to get some sort of data points back. And so at those earliest stages around some of those desirabilities, those are things like customer interviews, getting out there and having those conversations. It could be, maybe we've started to narrow down on who our customer segment is and their pain points, and we want to identify and test our value proposition. So maybe that's something where we're going to test our landing page and see if people ultimately convert and clicking through to the website. And so it's not, it's about kind of what is that, this is where that build comes in. What is it that you're going to build to ultimately to test that hypothesis? And so it doesn't have to be, something like the solution. It could be a prototype and a clickable prototype if it's a software or an app, to see how people ultimately navigate and utilize it. And so it's, what is that tangible asset thing that we're going to create? And that could be such as our interview guide. We don't necessarily want you to script it, and because there's oftentimes you limit the ability to identify those pain points or other stories that come from those conversations, but it's what is it that you're going to build and ultimately bring to the marketplace to test that hypothesis. And so I'll pass it back to you on, that measure element and the metric that we're looking to either, identify if we're on the right path or not.
Right. So we have an hypothesis. We think that this thing is true. Then we've picked the right tool to use to test it: landing page test, customer interviews, rapid prototyping, and all the other ones that you mentioned. And now it's time to say, okay, well, in order to put this out there and learn something from that, we actually have to measure something. If we just throw a social media post out into the ether and call that an experiment, we're going to say, oh, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because what does it mean to be successful there? So we have to measure something, and in the case of a social media post, that could be some engagement metric. It could be clicks, it could be likes or shares or whatever it is, in that process. And if you're running another kind of experiment, like rapid prototyping, it might be something like, do they get to the end of the task that you're having them complete? Right? Are they able to successfully get to the task? And because if they don't, then that signals that there's something faulty, maybe funky with our prototype. And so we're going to need to tweak our prototype a little bit, put it back in front of them. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that we're learning from that process, right? We're going to learn a lot by having customers go through the rapid prototype. We're going to see what works and what doesn't. And that's all very interesting, all that qualitative information that we get. But the thing that we're measuring, was the prototype successful, is were people able to complete the task? Because it's a prototype of a thing. And in the real world, the thing is to do something. So can people do the something? If you're doing a customer interview, your measurement is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be based on what you're trying to learn. And if you're trying to figure out, do people have the problem that I think that they do, then it's going to be looking for resonance at a certain percentage of the people that you're getting in front of with that problem. But there's something that you're measuring, that we're looking for, that this is the thing that I want to track to figure out if we're right. So we had an hypothesis and an experiment that we ran. That experiment involved us measuring something, and the last part of the test card is, we are right if. Right. And so that's that measurement just being a value, a particular value. Is it above or below a particular threshold that we're looking for? It's 3 out of 5 people had great problem resonance, or 4 out of 5 people were able to complete the task in our rapid prototype or whatever. Yeah. And that forms the completed card. So I think, Cameron, you want to jump in
here?
I
think just to one point on that, and we often get questions related to what do I know? How do I know if I'm targeting the right number? And I think part of it is it's a science and it's an art, right? So it's a matter of drawing a line in the sand for you to have that decision point, versus it kind of just aimlessly running the test, and then say 20% of the people demonstrated they had the pain point, but you never put a line in the sand to say, oh, it was actually 60% that I was looking for. And so now you can't really interpret that in any context, right? And so it gives you that decision point of, do I need to go back and redo this test, or do I actually need to amend ultimately what my hypothesis is based on my learnings there? And so I think as we are further in the life cycle of our startup, the numbers that we're identifying do have weight in terms of the sophistication of what that looks like. And a lot of that is, if you are trying to run a $10 million business, and there's only X number amount of customers, you have to actually be able to hit the right conversion rates to ultimately be able to get to the revenue success that you want to, right? And so, but at this earliest stages, when we're looking at some of that customer interviews or click-through rates, it's a little bit of that science and an art. And so it's kind of really drawing that line in the sand and giving yourself that space to make a decision from that. And so that's really what we're trying to empower you, is then now you have data that you're making a more informed decision of how you want to proceed forward.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the way that I like to think about this is that we want to get to a point where we can ask a question. We want to ask, what does this mean? And if we just say, oh, I'm going to track how many people click it, then we're giving ourselves permission to introduce a lot of bias when we ask, what does this mean? Right? Because we just said, oh, I got 8 likes. Well, I think 8 likes is probably all right. Or I'm a little dumb by 8 likes, But what does it mean? I don't know, because we didn't have any target at the outset. And so, yeah, science and art, and it's difficult to pick a measurement. But if you were to say, I'm basing this on what I think about our conversion rates. So I think we're going to get, X percentage along the way, and that's going to lead to this other thing. Then this is going to be the number that I pick, and you don't get that number. Then you can ask, well, what does this mean? Does this pose a fundamental problem to our business? Like, were we off by an order of magnitude, right? Or were we off by a little bit? And which direction were we off? Were we off in, right? Because if we were off in the positive direction, that might actually mean that we have some grace on the conversion rates further down our funnel. So like when it gets to our landing page, we can afford to have a little bit of a lower conversion rate because we got such a higher conversion rate here, or we've just made it into a more profitable business either way. So we're picking a number so that we can ask, what does this mean? And I kind of want to just expand really quickly on how I think about the process of getting one of those numbers. So I have this thing that I call the 3 rules of startups. I wrote an article on this. I'll throw it in the show notes. It's from a few weeks back, but basically the 3 rules of startups are to maintain a model, to separate fact from conjecture, and then to test the riskiest assumption, or the riskiest of those conjectures. Those are the 3 rules of the startup. And so maintaining a model is starting with, this is what I think the startup is. And really early stages, that's going to be high level. It's going to be, I think people have this problem that I want to solve this particular way. And so that's fine. And then in the really later stages, it's going to be people are coming in through this channel, and X% are going to convert to here. And then Y% are going to go from the landing page and sign up for freemium, and Z% are going to convert to premium, that kind of thing. So we'll have a much more robust model. But either way, we have a model, mental model, written model, a model of what we think the startup is. And then within that, we have to say, what do we know and what do we think we know? And amongst the things that we already know, great. Amongst the things that we just think we know, which ones of those are the riskiest of them? Which are the ones that are the greatest impact if we're wrong, right? They'll kill us if we're wrong, and that we have the least amount of data for. And of those, we want to test them. Right? Those are the ones we want to run out and test. And so that sort of tells us what we need to do, because the measurement is going to come from the role that conjecture plays in our model. Right? So if you're in the really early stages, which is where people get most tripped up by this, you're going to say something like, I expect people to have this problem that leads to this total addressable market, like this big group of people that I can conquer. And if you go out and start testing that, and you start finding that people don't have the problem that you think that they do, or fewer people have the problem that you think that they do, or the severity and urgency of that problem is less than you thought it was, then that decreases the overall size of your market. That changes the overall, opportunity here. And so that's what we're looking for, is what do we expect of that, like how many people to have that problem in order to make this an interesting business opportunity. So even at that stage, there's something that we can do just by picking a model and kind of maintaining it from there. Whereas if you're much further along, it becomes much more self-evident, right? We're expecting X number of people to convert from freemium to premium, right? Like it becomes really straightforward at that point.
Yeah, I think the last point, as we speak about the test cards and kind of this idea of cycles, where my mind goes is the learning aspect of it, right? And how ultimately, once we get evidence that either validates or invalidates it's answering that question of, how does this then therefore change my model or what I'm going to do going forward, right? And so I think that's a really key thing. It's not about then just go build the next test. Is if you get everything's that house of cards. So if you're building based on that assumption and you validate it, okay, now what's the next riskiest thing that I need to understand and gain evidence for? But if you got evidence that didn't back that up, what changes? And then therefore the rest of the model changes as you go forward. And so we need to recognize that interconnection between all of the elements of our business model, who we're targeting and what their pain points are, and then how we're delivering value in relation to that. And so if one of those elements shifts, everything ultimately shifts overall. And so we need to identify what that looks like. And so that's where we get to that decision point, which allows us to then go back to building that successful model.
100%. And it is hard, and it's not complicated, but it is really, really hard. And it's oftentimes really hard to figure out what those right levers to pull on and like what we actually need to test. And so this concept of cycles is pretty straightforward, right? You got stuff you got to learn, go learn it well. Like and the only people who can give you those learnings are customers. It's the marketplace. So it's pretty straightforward. Go out and get data, figure out what that means, go get more data. So it's not really complicated, but it is really hard. And if you want to, you know, figure out how to do that in the real world under real world conditions, you can come to the Startup Challenge in September. We'll again put all the details in the show notes there. If you can't be in Sacramento for that, which most of you probably can't, and that's fine, still look up any of the programs that Cameron runs at the Carlson Center or anything that I run. Outside of that, again, we'll put those links in the show notes so you can check all of that out and just lean into that process, get more data from customers. But with that, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this annual edition of the Zero to Traction podcast. We'll get to a more regular schedule here, we promise. But before we wrap this one up, we of course have some frivolous thoughts to share, because this would not be Zero to Traction without frivolous thoughts. So Cameron, what do you got for us?
Oh man, I was hoping you were gonna do the mix-up of frivolity again.
I've had a year to practice.
So maybe that's why we haven't brought our recent episode out, as we've been working really hard on saying frivolous thoughts here. But
my brain just wants to say frivolity. I don't know why. My brain wants to say frivolity, and when I try to say frivolous thoughts, the it just gets stuck as my brain tries to redirect me away from frivolity.
I love it. Well, the one that I'll bring in was, I've been watching these videos of old sayings and where they came from, and the one that stood out and I guess kind of circles back to the launch of the Startup Challenge out of the pandemic was the concept of quarantine. Actually, and the saying came from ancient Venice, where if there was a plague on a ship, they were set to stay outside of the city walls for 40 days. So for quaranta, and therefore that's where the name quarantine came from. So connecting a few of those dots, I might bring some of those old sayings and where they came from. But that we're still continuing to use them today, even though we might not stick to the 40-day rules that they had.
I love that. I'm sort of an etymology nerd, so you're kind of speaking right to me deep. Love it. So for my frivolous thought, one of the bigger reasons that we had such a long delay in Zero to Traction was because I became a dad, and so I've cut my kid is now almost 15 months, 14 and change. And that does some weird things to how you're able to spend your time. And so my favorite thought, I have just gotten back into a project that I started when we were pregnant, but before he was born, which was going back through and reading both for pleasure and just with a critical eye, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I read when I was a kid. I'm not a big fantasy guy. I don't have a shelf full of fantasy novels. I've never been that guy. I mostly read nonfiction, read some classical literature. But something just drove me. I want to go back through. I want to read this. I want to see if Tolkien's all he's cracked up to be. See if it held up. And so I basically took almost as long of a hiatus from that book as I did from Zero to Traction. And I just recently got back into reading. I'm in the middle of the second book, The Two Towers, and I gotta say it does hold up. It is super interesting. There's a lot going on there. The movies, while the movies are good, that's fine. Jackson did a great job, but there's a lot of rich texture that is completely missing from the movies. And if you're looking for something that you can both get some intellectual stimulation around, but also in some senses a little bit brain candy, because it is, this fantasy world, then, come read along with me. If you start now, probably you'll finish all three before I manage to finish the third book. But so yeah, that's my frivolous thought. It's a good, Lord of the Rings is a great read. Highly recommend.
Love it.
Well, with that, that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to follow or subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you might be listening to this. For those of you watching live on YouTube right now, definitely hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the loop on all of the future shows that we're going to run. You can also follow this show on Substack for free. Of course, the link is in the show notes for that. And if you have found this helpful, if you found this interesting, do us a favor, leave a 5 5-star review, share it with a friend. We must appease the AI algorithm, my friends, and a review would really help us in doing that. And that's it, Cameron. Thank you so much for joining me again on the annual mark here. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks. And it's really good hanging out.
It's good to